Morning glory and evening grace, America. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving weekend. I'm starting off December 1st, rabbit, with Haviv Rettig Gore, senior analyst for the Times of Israel, host of Ask Haviv Anything. He also has his own Patreon if you want to participate in that community, which there are additional benefits for. But Haviv, thank you for joining me as you do so often when big issues are arising. I want to get to Isabella Tabarovsky's Be a Refusnik, but first, would you give me your reaction to the pardon proposition? I'm not going to put it as a request made by the Prime Minister to the President of Israel.
Yeah, good to be here. Just also the free press, important to mention.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, no, but thank you. Thank you also for mentioning the rest. I am of two minds about it. Traditionally, a pardon request in Israeli law requires an admission of guilt. It's a pardon after a conviction, after guilt, after there's a sentence. Netanyahu has actually said that there's no conviction, there's no admission, I'm not guilty. And he framed it as, I want to spare the country more turmoil, more division. This trial has divided us. I have commented, and we've talked about it here on this show, about my concerns, my serious concerns with his trials. But getting out of it by a presidential pardon with the excuse that it's hurting politics seems to me a little bit of a strange thing. One of the surprising things we've seen is actually the number of his supporters, and it's a double-digit percentage of Likud voters who there have been polls on this done, especially by right-wing news outlets, who are upset by this request. They want the trial to go forward. They want him exonerated. They believe he is innocent, and so it's kind of thrown everything into a very complicated kind of situation. I would like the trial to go away, but I don't want it to go away as a freebie that a prime minister gets because he's prime minister, or because his supporters in politics are willing to, stampede their way through the court system. With all my critique of the courts, and some of it is very much aligned with some of the right-wing critiques of the court system, you don't get off scot-free because you're a prime minister and it's going to hurt the country otherwise. That's almost vaguely threatening language. So I'm concerned about this idea. I do want the trial to go away. Netanyahu won't admit even just, the guilt of having done things that are just incredibly inappropriate, which he did, which he's basically admitted to already just in the facts of the case presented by the defense. I don't like it.
So let me ask you to put yourself in President Herzog's shoes, the way that Gerald Ford did when he had to pardon Richard Nixon in 1974, making a list of the pros and the cons. 50 years later, everybody applauds Ford for doing it, for saving the country going through a difficult period of time for no good use. What are the pros and cons you think are on President Herzog's yellow pad, down the middle, pros on the right side, cons on the left side?
I think Netanyahu wants, I think there's a campaign. We're going to elections, is what this tells me. And I think that there's a campaign gimmick here, more than actually a deep sort of legal discourse. And I think that because the Netanyahu's letter to the public and Netanyahu's video to the public doesn't really give legal reasons, doesn't really give any serious. It's much more about politics and making us all feel like a united country again, because the one thing that divided us, not the judicial reform, not the way the government handled itself, not some of the language of the opposition over the last 3, 4, 5 years, but the trial. That's the thing that divided the country. All of that tells me that he wants either the refusal of a pardon, or he wants a pardon, and he expects the president, in exchange for a pardon, to demand things. For example, recusing himself from the prime minister's chair, resigning, and then he runs in the next election as a private citizen, not as a prime minister, as head of a party, right? Not as prime minister. And he wants the next election to then be a referendum on the trial, a referendum on should he come back, a referendum on, they kicked me out with this fake trial. Do you want that to be the way they decide prime ministers, or do you actually want to decide prime ministers? He wants a narrative of the next election in which the right has to feels like it has to come together in solidarity. By the way, the opposition has also told us what it's going to run on. Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, literally declared that he's going to basically run on the ultra-Orthodox draft. A lot of us have done a lot of painful sacrificing over the last 2 years. Many of the coalition voters, the ultra-Orthodox parties and others, have done a lot of painful sacrificing over the last 2 years. Many of the coalition voters, the ultra-Orthodox parties and others, haven't sacrificed the way the rest of us have sacrificed. That's what this election is going to be about. And so they're basically kind of trying to position themselves differently for the election. And I think this is more gimmick than anything. If Herzog gives him, gets him, lets him get off scot-free, it actually kind of loses him some of his own supporters. It doesn't look like an innocent man. It looks like somebody who needed, who didn't want to go through the court system.
But again, I'm going to go back to putting Netanyahu and Lapid to both sides. You're just President Herzog. The only Israeli president I know anything about is Shimon Peres, and I only know about him because he was prime minister. But if you're the president of Israel and you're thinking about what they're going to write about you in 50 years and 100 years and 200 years, God willing, the state is surviving and thriving, what's he do on the pardon to get the best thing written about him?
My sense is he doesn't want to deal with it. He doesn't want to pardon Netanyahu. That brings a whole. It would be, by the way, an unprecedented pardon. Then nothing like it has happened. Netanyahu has argued that case 300, in which some Shabak operatives killed Palestinian terrorists who had captured a bus and killed some of the people in the bus, and some of those terrorists were killed in custody. That case, they received, some of them, a pardon from a president, but they had already been convicted and found guilty. It's not at all a parallel. This would be an unprecedented pardon, in a sense, an expansion of the president's pardon powers, especially for Netanyahu. Olmert went to prison. Katzov went to prison. Very different crimes, of course, but nevertheless, they went to prison, a president and a prime minister. They didn't get pardons. The idea that he would get a pardon, why? Because it's politically divisive. I don't think Herzog wants to go down that. I don't think he wants that to be his legacy. A president of Israel doesn't have a whole lot of things he gets to decide. It's mostly a ceremonial role. The big decision he will have in his term will be this one. Is this what he wants?
Right.
So I think he's going to try and avoid it, or try and condition it, or just not give it, and force Netanyahu to run on something else. They'll call him a left winger. Who he was the former head of the Labor Party.
Okay.
He is a left winger.
I know nothing about Israeli history except what I've learned from guests on this show and a couple of books. But I'm going to guess he gives him the pardon because Jerry Ford was proven right, even though he lost the election because of it. It was best for the country to pardon Nixon, also unprecedented, also never expected, and facing an election on a date certain. But Ford wins in history. If Herzog cares about history, I think he'll do it. Let me turn to, before we get to be a refusenik, and I want to make sure people hear about that. Syria and Lebanon, it appears from news reports that they are both heating up. By heating up, I mean war returns to both fronts. Is that your assumption at this point?
Yes. Until October 7, nobody noticed anything happening in the Arab world. The Arab world could, around us, countries around us, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, which is an Arab, but nevertheless part of the Middle East, they could arm, they could declare their desire to murder a nation, they could do whatever they wanted, and everybody just sort of wrote it off as in the Middle East, being weird and crazy in the Middle East. And then on October 7, it was driven home to Israelis that they mean it, that they're serious, that our adversaries are as smart as we are, because they're tyrannies, because they're ideological extremists. They're not so competent as we are, but they are exactly as smart as we are. If they have the element of surprise, they can do terrible damage. And Israel now has a fundamental strategic ethos that it is no longer going to let anything build up on its borders. We already are watching. We are watching. Iran is back in play. Hezbollah has been building up very seriously. The Lebanese state desperately wants to control Lebanon and have Hezbollah not be building a new militia, rebuilding its militia in Lebanon, but it is failing to do so. It doesn't have the courage to do so. Lebanese officials are terrified that going after Hezbollah more seriously will relaunch that disastrous Lebanese civil war. And in Syria, it's basically Turkey's game. Syria is essentially patron of Turkey. Giuliani, the new president, could bring a lot of stability, but that stability is at the cost of doing Turkey's bidding. And Turkey is a great supporter of Hamas. Turkey's ruling party, the AKP party, is a Muslim Brotherhood party. And so Israel is watching Syria and Lebanon. There have been missteps. There's been a lot of debate about this in Israeli press. Some of the things the Israeli government has done in Lebanon and Syria have been, I think, very wise. Some of them have been not so wise. But the fundamental strategy is you don't let them rebuild, and they're rebuilding. And the only time anybody notices any of this is when Israel blows something up. But they're not noticing that Hezbollah is returning to stockpiling, to training, to preparing for to drag Lebanon into the next war. So yes, they're absolutely heating up, and hopefully a small limited operation now can give us, another couple of years of not having to go to a serious war that Hezbollah plans to be much more destructive.
You heard it here first, America. Now let me turn to Isabella Tabarovsky. A fascinating episode of Ask Haviv Anything. You've got to listen to this. She has written a book called How to Be a Refusnik, a Jewish Student Survival Guide, which, if I were Jewish and had kids going to college, I would give to them. But in the course of your conversation, you mentioned something about Israelis and not knowing their own history or the history of the Jews around the world. I like to say in America, the older people forget everything and the younger people don't learn anything, and therefore we don't have much of a history that's operative in politics. Does the average Israeli high school, junior high student learn Jewish history, back to the Maccabees, back to 66 CE? Do they understand how it all happened? Is there even a common textbook?
Yeah, there are a couple different common textbooks. There are a couple different curricula that schools can opt into. Israel also has a kind of, I think that's called a voucher system, where a group of parents, if it's a big enough group, can actually found a school with its own sort of line. Arab schools in the Arab community speak Arabic. They have a slightly different curriculum. Some of it's set by the actual community. So there's a lot of diversity in the Israeli education system, but I think most Jewish kids, and there's huge diversity just among the Jews, but most Jewish kids, they do learn a lot of Jewish history, but they learn, I would say, meaningful history that is seen as identity forming. So they will learn the sages of the Talmud. They will learn the story of the Maccabees. They will learn about the first temple, the second temple. They will learn about many of the great tragedies that happened to the Jews: the expulsion from Spain, the Khmelnytsky massacres, the Crusades, not the Crusades as a Muslim Christian clash in the Holy Land, but what happened when Crusaders came down the Rhine River and the terrible, terrible atrocities committed against the Jewish communities there. They will learn what the Jewish experience was. Of course, they'll learn about Zionism and modern Israel, but there's so much they don't learn. And they don't learn things that are really fundamental to understanding this historical moment. They don't learn enough about the Muslim world. Critical support. There were great times between Jews and Muslims in history. There were some really evil, terrible times in which Muslims mistreated Jews very, very badly in Muslim Jewish history. They don't learn much about it of any kind. And so one of the stories that Isabella Tabarovsky really wants Israeli kids she wants Jewish kids in America, college kids in America to know, but I would also like Israeli Jewish kids to know, is the astonishing story of Soviet Jews and the stories of heroism that come out of there, but also of the Soviet Empire. Americans know how evil the Soviet Empire was, but imagine actually living under it and in it, and imagine being defined by it as an evil opponent of communism in your very identity and nature, and having to survive 80 years of concerted Soviet attempt to erase your culture and society. That is what the Jews, the 2 million, 3 million Jews of the Soviet Union went through over 4 generations. And that story, Israeli kids don't learn, Jewish kids in America don't learn. That's a story that we need to get back to seriously learning.
Last question for this time, Haviv. America's majority Christian country. I'm a Christian. My wife's a Christian, and we enjoyed a series that ran for 6 or 7 seasons called The Chosen, which is set primarily in the life of Jesus. I'm just curious if anyone has seen it in Israel and what they think of the depiction of life in Roman occupied Judea, circa 20 to 40 CE, as best we can tell. Have you seen it?
I have not. No, I'm sorry. I have not seen it. But now that you said that it's an important artifact of culture right now, I will go and see it. I think the Jews generally, you sort of wake Jews up, Israeli Jews at least. I don't know what happens with American Jews. You wake them up at 3 in the morning and say to them, "Time of Jesus, what do you think happened?" And their basic sense of things, what they kind of learn, what's in the air, what's in the education curriculum, is that it was a terribly oppressive state that would go on, by the way, to carry out 2 major massacres. There was also the Bar Kokhba revolt about a century later that the Romans probably exiled or killed a million people. And so it was a time of tremendous, tremendous oppression. And to most Jews, I think Jesus' story fits within that kind of
Yeah, well,
frame.
this
A
is
lot of
what
rabbis, yeah.
the series does very well, and I wasn't aware that it was going to take this tack. Roman occupation plays an enormous role in this, and so does observance of the law. So does the Pharisees, the Sadducees, random preachers like Jesus who have followings, and generally women being subservient to men, but how the local how there's a backwater town and a major town. I'm just curious if anyone ever critiqued it or reviewed it from an Israeli point of view as to its authenticity about first century BC and first century AD Israel, because that's what it's all about. And I thought, oh, that's pretty fascinating. I wonder if anyone's done it. Apparently not, or you would know about it, Habib. I would think you would know about it. I appreciate this. Have a wonderful holiday season ahead. To the extent that the Israelis, celebrate December the way Americans do, enjoy it, even if
Hanukkah is
you're on the
coming.
precipice of Hanukkah's coming. But that's not all month, right? That's seven
No,
days, 8 days.
and it's not a very big holiday. It got big because it has to compete with Christmas, but it's one of the minor ones. Yeah.
Well, have a happy Hanukkah, and I'll talk to you again in the new year. Thank you, Aviv.
Thank you.